I don't wanna grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has 100 questions I can play with. So I'll open my arms and eyes and wonder every day till the day I die. No one really knows why gravity.
All right, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Henry Gilbert is Associate Professor of Biological Anthropology at CSU East Bay, and he's a researcher at the UC Berkeley Human Evolution Research Center. He earned his PhD in integrative biology at Cal at UC Berkeley in 2003. Since then, Dr. Gilbert has authored several books and a torrent of journal articles, often on his own remarkable Homo erectus findings, many of those taking place in Ethiopia. He has continued to study and publish and teach on Homo erectus, the subject of tonight's presentation. Please join me in giving a fully upright and erect welcome to Dr. Henry Gilbert.
Thanks very much, Tucker, for that wonderful introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here with all you guys. I love Wonderfest. It's a real great organization. I'm happy that all of you guys are supporting it, and I'm really happy that you guys came out to hear me say what I have to say. I've got a lot to say, and I'm going to try to get it as crammed into this hour or hour and a half or whatever it is that we have. And I'm going to stop a couple of times. So there'll be a couple of different stops through the lecture where you can ask questions, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you've got, as long as I can answer them. I'll say I can't answer them if I can't. So today's lecture is about Homo erectus, and it's actually a really good title, What Happened to Homo erectus? Because in a way, it's sort of a more confusing concept these days than it once was. And I'll try to clear up a little bit of that confusion throughout the talk, but I'm also going to be introducing a whole bunch of information about the new stuff that we know about Homo erectus that's come out in the last 20, 30 years. This is my first human evolution book. This one right here. Oh, it looks like I lost the place. Nope, there it is. I had this book in kindergarten, and you guys can see it's up there. I want to call out the authors. It was authored by Tom McGowan and illustrated by Rod Root. You can get it. You can still buy the used copy for about $1.99. But one of the things that's really interesting about this is that it was pretty simple back in 1975. It turns out that in the underground it had already started to get a little bit complicated, but we had this nice line going from Ramapithecus, which nobody thinks is a real direct human ancestor anymore, through Australopithecus, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens, in this case depicted as Cro-Magnon. I went to the American Museum of Natural History a couple of years ago, and this is what this display was on the wall. And I'll give it a little bit of an illustrated background, because this same thing has been published in a lot of different places. And it's more confusing now. It's more confusing than it once was. And to tell you the truth, now, do we have a common ancestor with some sort of monkey? Kinda, right? I mean, there's a direct line that goes back to some kind of a monkey, but when I look for a direct line that leads from some of these early hominids to these later ones, you don't really see it anymore, right? It's kind of depicted as sort of like a bush. It's depicted more of this sort of bushy, fragmented phylogeny than it once was. Now, in some ways that's sort of correct, but in some ways it's also kind of confusing, because it is true that there was a single lineage that took us back to some of these forms, right? And in a way, when we find ancestor fossils, we're finding information about that lineage, right? So hopefully, as I go through the discussion tonight, I'll be sort of introducing you to some of the concepts that led to this sort of new, well, I would like to think of this as a sort of an old, new sort of way of thinking about things, and I'll try to tell you about the way that I consider the things, because it turns out that this is just as much of a hypothesis as the single lineage was, right? It's just as much of a hypothesis. So we got to get a little bit historical, and so the first part of the talk is going to be something about history. A lot of you guys probably know that the first human fossil to be found was a Neanderthal, and actually the first Neanderthal to be recognized wasn't the first one that was found, but we'll start there anyway. This is the one that's found in the Neanderthal Valley by a school teacher named Fulrot, and he suggested that there was a primitive looking And to tell you the truth, even though it's before Darwin, lots of people were talking about evolutionary change and ancestors and primitive kinds of things. But of course, Darwin comes really soon after the discovery and kind of recognition of this, and we all know that that's sort of a big effect, right? The origin of species was something that maybe not everybody really believed all the way, but a lot of people were talking about it, and a lot of people were influenced by the origin of species. And when Homo neanderthalensis is named as a new species, it's a couple of years after the origin has come out, and the ape-like features are emphasized. Some people were okay with that. A lot of people were not okay with that. In fact, a lot of prominent people were not okay with that. One guy in particular that's sort of famous for decrying this Neanderthal discovery is named Virchow. And Virchow was actually kind of a cool guy. He was a kind of a guy who was saying, you know, we can't look at different types of people as different. And that same kind of, I don't know, political correctness of the time, he applied to Neanderthals and said, you know those Cossacks, they're kind of weird looking, right? It could easily be sort of a pathological Cossack that we found there. And, you know, a lot of people were more comfortable with that than with thinking that there was some kind of a human ape ancestor sort of a thing, or that there was Neanderthals as a human ancestor. Now, in the later 1880s, after Virchow is really talking a lot about the Neanderthals, more get found. And at this famous site called Spee in Belgium, there were more than one individual with skeletons and crania, and the crania looked just like the Neanderthal Valley one. And so it was really impossible to say that this is some sort of pathological condition anymore. And very soon after this, your daddy, Homo erectus, was discovered. And there's a lot of irony as to why it was discovered, where it was, but we're not going to get into that on this talk. We're just going to get into how people interpreted it, right? So this is in a time when people are looking for the missing link in Asia, and they find something. And you know what? It was a lot different from Neanderthals. While if you look at it superficially and you flip through the pages of a book, you'll see, oh, wow, they kind of look the same, big brow ridges, sort of long and low, but the Neanderthal is a lot bigger than these Homo erectus fossils, or this Homo erectus fossil that was found. And, you know, the world of paleoanthropology at the time accepted it as an earlier ancestor, and the first thing that you would do is sort of make this sort of line from Homo erectus to Neanderthals to Homo sapiens. And that view sort of took, I guess, a little bit of scientific hold, but it still wasn't quite the right time for this sort of concept to catch on all the way. I mean, people still hadn't fully accepted natural selection as the driving force of evolution. Pretty much all the biologists were thinking that there had been some sort of evolutionary change, but there were lots of ideas about how, you know, you get grooves of morphology cut, and to tell you the truth, a lot of people wondered about what humans were, and it seemed kind of, well, it seemed kind of weird to be thinking about this sort of earlier ape-like human. And a lot of paleoanthropologists and anthropologists started to really question if this was the right way of looking at things. Maybe these Neanderthals and Homo erectus fossils are these brutish ape-like fossils, and they're really, really distant from the line leading to humans. And there were some really major discoveries in France in the early 1900s that were interpreted as being incredibly ape-like. And these discoveries led to the development of an idea called the pre-sapiens hypothesis, that there was a sort of from the neck down kind of, or actually from the mouth down, sort of an ape-like creature that had a big brain. In other words, people were thinking that there was something really special about humans, and that really special thing must have been the brain. And so they kind of hypothesized this ancestor that was the ancestor of Homo sapiens and something different from Homo erectus and Neanderthals. Piltdown sort of hits the scene really soon after that. And a lot of the people that were involved in the development of what was called this pre-sapiens hypothesis, this notion that there's a real separation between Neanderthals and Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, bought right into it, right? Nobody really knows who the perpetrator was or anything like that, but a lot of people fell for it. And they fell for it so much that when real human ape ancestors, or when real ape man ancestors started to come out, they just sort of wrote them off. They were from the wrong place, right? They were from Africa, which is not a place that anybody was looking for the direct human ancestor. And so Piltdown was kind of taking center stage. Now, this sort of strays away a little bit from the Homo erectus thread, but to be honest with you, lots of Homo erectus fossils start to get discovered during the 20s and 30s. The big sites of the 20s and 30s are Chokutien and Guangdong, also Sangaron in China and in the Southeast Asian islands of Java, and actually is all on Java. And a lot of them were found, right? There's a lot of Homo erectus fossils that are found in the 20s and 30s. Chokutien and Guangdong, you just saw, Sangaron. And it's really interesting the way that these were interpreted, depending on where you were coming from. You know, a lot of people, when they saw this and when they had looked at the Tong child, started to really wonder whether or not this sort of notion that humans were so separate from the apes was really true, right? So it's actually kind of overstating things to say that nobody believed that the Tong child was a human ancestor. People had actually in the underground started to believe that, but certainly the sort of prominent, proper, and most popular view is sort of espoused by the English scientific establishment, people like Arthur Keith, and this is actually from Louis Leakey's first big book, Adam's Ancestors, really thought that there was a big separation between Homo sapiens and these Homo erectus fossils and Neanderthals and everything else. I'll give you a little bit of a closer look at that. Kind of goes along with some of the perceptions that they had of humans too, because if you'll look, the races are very, very separate at this time. And they're sort of, each one of these different discoveries, at least in Leakey's conception, was given a separate line, right? Here's Eoanthropus, this is Piltdown, and you see this is like way separating the things apart, right? So this is the kind of idea that started to take hold, or actually didn't really start to take hold, that was really popular in the 1920s and 1930s among the establishment of paleoanthropology. But like I said, on the underground, people were starting to see things differently, and actually biologists had been seeing things differently for quite some time. Paleoanthropologists are always late to the game when it comes to sort of understanding the full details of evolutionary biology, but by the time that you got to the 1920s and 1930s, the modern evolutionary synthesis, population genetics, thinking about species in terms of populations and all the different kinds of structure that you could have to populations. Populations aren't just sort of a corral with a countable number of individuals. They're complicated and they're draped across landscapes in really sort of difficult to understand ways. And during the 1920s and 1930s, people started to see that, and people started to realize that there was more than just kind of natural selection causes speciation. There's a lot of different ways that you can conceive speciation, and there's lots of different ways, actually, that you can conceive species, right? I mean, I guess a better way to put it is that species are not these giant ideal populations. They can be complicated in a lot of different ways. Most paleoanthropologists were just naming a new species for each site without even thinking about it in terms of geography or populations or things like that. And paleoanthropologists got sort of scolded at the same time that biologists had stopped perceiving in these sort of simple branching lines as thinking about species, right? During this time, the concept of an evolutionary species sort of became popular in mainstream biology. In fact, it really doesn't hit paleontology or a lot of zoology sort of systematics until you get to the 1950s and 1960s. But people had started to talk about it in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And this concept, an evolutionary species, a species as being something that sort of held together by a common niche, by a common geography, and that might have a lot of sort of complicated demes or subpopulations, depending on what you want to call it, inside of it. In other words, an evolutionary species tolerates variation and tolerates population structure to a certain degree. Ernst Mayr, who a lot of you might have heard of, is responsible for coming up with the concept of Homo erectus. In fact, he is the one that took paleoanthropologists to the task. He's the one that said, you guys, you can't name a new species for each fossil that you find. It's obviously not biologically sensible. You would expect there to be variation. You would expect there to be clinal variation. You should put all those Pleistocene fossils that you're finding into a single species. It's the only real way to make sense of it. And this is actually at a time when a lot of things were happening in paleoanthropology. It's after World War II. Finally, after 30 years of being on the underground, the South African fossils had been recognized for actually being human ancestors, if you can believe it. And so all of a sudden, anthropology or paleoanthropology was sort of experiencing a heyday. It was experiencing a time when a lot of people were paying attention. And it wasn't sort of too far after this time that you got paleoanthropologists starting to become recognized as sort of being a real part of evolutionary biology, that it also started to hit the mainstream, right? The leaky finds at Olduvai Gorge hit National Geographic in 1960, right? And that captured everybody. It's kind of interesting when you think about like all these different people that came before Louis Leakey in Africa finding fossils. And Louis Leakey is famous, right? He's really famous. And, you know, for relatively good reason. He found some really good fossils. There's another thing that he's really famous for. One of my friends, Garnus Curtis, dated all of his fossils. From the Rift Valley, because of the volcanics, you can get dates, right? And so all of a sudden there was a timeline that associated with this, and that's a really big deal. It's a major part of the understanding. Another thing happens with Olduvai Gorge that sort of plays into this sort of, was it one line or are there multiple lines or whatever, and it's almost like we're starting to see a direction move away from that sensibility that Ernst Mayr had put inside of paleoanthropology. There's two different taxa that exist at Olduvai Gorge, and it's actually really pretty clear, right? And it's not just Olduvai Gorge. Olduvai Gorge is the first place that you see this, and there's big differences. I could hand around the fossils, and you guys would all go, wow, yeah, those are different, right? And they're consistently different from a lot of different sites. So Olduvai Gorge has this place called Swartkrans in South Africa, Kubifora. Since then, and this is not part of what's going on at this time, but certainly Kubifora, Swartkrans, and Olduvai Gorge were on people's minds during the late 60s and into the early 70s. Now we have lots of evidence. This is evidence from Conso, and you can see how different these teeth are. And when you find more than one fossil, they're bimodal. So there's really no question about whether or not there's two different species. Good guy Clark Howell, a very esteemed paleoanthropologist, somebody who I have a lot of respect for, worked at Omo, and Omo's the place where you really see this because you have a whole bunch of teeth, and they really do have this bimodal distribution. So as we roll into the 70s, everybody in paleoanthropology accepts that there's at least two different lineages. Everybody accepts that there's lineages going on, and it's happening at a time when we're see a methodology take hold in evolutionary biology called cladistics. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of cladistics. We hope that a few people have. But cladistics really started to take hold. And in order to do a cladistic analysis, I mean, it's something that actually sort of requires a computer. And to tell you the truth, even Linnaeus was using a similar logic to cladistics, where you're sort of grouping things by their shared derived, their homologies, rather than their primitive features. But it was in the 1970s that we achieved the computational power that allowed us to actually process big groups, right? Where you could actually look at long lists of characters and look at long lists of taxa and sort of make sense out of them. And to just give you a simple example, the way that cladistics operates is it compares lineages. And when you have more features that link those groups together, it prefers that explanation for the phylogeny over one that has fewer ones. So in a case where you're wondering whether bats and birds are more closely related to each other than rats, it turns out that the mammal features that they have in common overwhelm the system, right? They overwhelm it, and they show you very clearly that bats and rats are closely related. There's a few assumptions of cladistics, and they're actually pretty easy to meet in most cases. Changing characteristics occurs in lineages over time. Any group of organisms related by descent from a common ancestor. Homology is more common than convergent evolution. I'm not going to get into this one. This one gets a little debatable as you get sort of closer to sort of more recent taxa, but it's easy to assume for the large scale for sure. There's another assumption, right, and that is that the taxa that you're analyzing are actually bifurcating lineages. You can do cladistics without that, but if you're actually looking for species differences, you're assuming that before you put it into the cladistic analysis, right? It's going to give you a branching pattern whether or not the taxa that you put in there are actually biological species, right? Okay. Cladistics has a huge positive effect on mainstream paleontology. Does everybody know that everybody know that birds are dinosaurs, right? People used to argue about it a lot, right? People used to argue based on one feature or another feature. Hello? Okay. That looks more like birds. That looks less like birds. And there was a lot of squabbling about whether or not birds are dinosaurs. And cladistics effectively eliminated that discussion because the number of features that align birds with dinosaurs overwhelm the number that don't, right? And so this kind of process, actually, dinosaurs is a good way to illustrate it, but it had a sweeping effect across all sorts of different branches of paleontology. And, you got 2 lineages in paleoanthropology, right? Why not apply cladistics? And during the 1970s, we see the first applications of cladistics to paleoanthropology. Now, it's during the 1970s that you start to get people naming new species again. To tell you the truth, there'd always been species namings going on in the background, but nobody really listened to this because most people were thinking about things as these sort of structured populations, and they weren't too amenable to new species coming in. Homo erectus, though, is named in 1975. It's not going to become popular until later. There's big discussions in the 1980s about cladistics and Homo erectus. And a lot of people hypothesize that maybe Asian Homo erectus is its own species from African Homo erectus. A lot of people start to talk about that. And in the very earliest 90s, a guy named Bernard Wood names some of the specimens that he finds from Cubifora Homo erectus. And ever since then, we see this name increasing in popularity. Homo erectus is of late, decreasing in popularity. It's still way more popular than Homo erectus, right? But this species name starts to take off, and it's continuing to take off. This is from John Hawk's website, where he uses the, Google Ngram Viewer. You can look at the popular use of different phrases in books across a whole bunch of time. I checked it out also in Google Scholar, and you can see that hits for Homo erectus in Google Scholar also go up considerably in the past 20 years. So back to our tree. That's what I saw. That's what it looks like when you're trying to look at Homo erectus now. So is Homo erectus an ancestor or not? Well, when you run the cladistics on it, it branches it off in a different direction. But you're assuming, before you even put the things together, that those two are different species. I'm not saying that you can't use cladistics on taxa that are not separate species. People do it all the time, and they find patterns. It's just not going to tell you whether or not they're different species. You assume that the lines that you put in there are different lineages if you want that kind of information. These days, it's kind of hard to think of Homo erectus as an ancestor, right? It's kind of hard. I'm almost to the first sort of question and answer session, but I want to point out one last little point about the cladistics as it relates to human ancestors. So this assumption that there's a bifurcating or branching pattern of lineage splitting inside of these sort of larger sets of taxa is pretty easy to assume, right? What about for Pleistocene hominids? Were these guys interbreeding? Maybe. In fact, there's a little bit of genetic evidence these days that suggests they quite possibly were, right? And if they were, well, you can run a cladistic analysis, but it's not going to show you whether or not they're different species. You're assuming that the operational taxonomic units, the taxa that you put in there, are their own species. And if the cladogram comes out with branches, well, of course, if I did a cladistic analysis that did the characters of each one of you guys and gave each one of you guys as a taxa, it'd be a big set of branches. It would look like you were all different species. And it might say something about sort of, I suppose, depending on how we did the analysis, we might be able to draw out sort of origins of your ancestors a little bit, but it doesn't mean that we're different species, right? It just would be sort of a cluster analysis of like what the background was. And it's sort of fed into this what I think is kind of over-splitting, to tell you the truth. Okay, so there we go for the first question and answer session. I'll be coming back to this in just a second.
All right, are there any questions now at the midpoint? Hands in the air. Nobody's curious about anything yet? Okay, coming over. Okay, I'll come over there next.
I might have missed this, but can you give an operational definition of a species? What defines a species? And has that changed in recent years?
if you give me some time, I can give you about 30 different definitions of species.
Okay,
right?
what's your favorite?
Well, I mean, to tell you the truth, when I think about species, when I go out and I walk in the hills and I look around, I go, coyote, that's a species. Wolf, that's a species. Cat, that's a species. Raccoon, that's a species. It turns out that there's lots of hybrid zones between coyotes and wolves. They just don't do it very much. Actually, I sort of debatable as to whether they do it a whole bunch or not. But I guess that I would sort of favor a loose biological definition of species. That's what I think of, right? Now, when I'm thinking about what bins to put the hominid fossils in, to be honest with you, because most people think about that, that's how most people conceive species, I think that that's kind of the right way to be trying to approach this stuff. It's difficult because people get a lot of credit for naming new species in human paleontology and paleoanthropology, right? But I like to try to keep it something that makes sense to the most people. I think that's kind of what our job is. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, over on the other side. Who was it?
Hi, I have a question on the Piltdown man. We sort of intuitively see the negative of the Piltdown man and when it's exposed, but what about the positive aspect of Piltdown man and getting everybody excited about the subject, even though without good reason, as it turned out, but nevertheless awakened a lot of people to the subject itself? Was there a positive dimension as well as the negative?
Well, I guess that the controversy that was generated led to a lot of people trying to explain themselves a lot. But to be honest with you, I'm not really sure that it's a good thing. I mean, a lot of this stuff is pretty straightforward and pretty sensible. And I think that doing the best that you can to present it in a simple, sort of readily understandable format is something that's good. And certainly you can look at a lot of the controversy that we have about teaching evolution in schools and things like that. And honestly, Piltdown has figured pretty heavily into that and potentially set that kind of discourse back 30 years, right? So imagine if all those kids had evolution in 1950. Right? Piltdown ended up being a nice talking point for anybody that wanted to get evolution out of the textbooks, keep it from being taught in class. And, you know, I guess I've thought about it a little bit, but I think that this subject is pretty profound, and I think that we're actually kind of on the very edge of a pretty profound social change that results from this. I look at the stuff that's going on in the world, and I can't help but think if everybody was kind of more scientific, we wouldn't be seeing half of the garbage that we see right now. And sort of as quickly as we can make that happen, I think that's good. And so while certainly that kind of negative controversy does generate some sort of attention, I'm not sure. I think that, you know, I still have to give classes where I explain that stuff. And you know what? I still have people that sort of turn their head down and decide that they don't really feel like they actually have to confront this stuff as a result of it. So I don't like Piltdown. I think those guys are crooks.
Earlier you mentioned that there were a number of fossils that were found in Africa and initially just dismissed because we clearly weren't from there. I guess I don't know the history of why they would just easily just dismiss that. Why was there such a apprehension to say we're not from Africa?
Well, I mean, it's easy to sort of put it in the sort of racist terms that we kind of are thinking of these days. But and to tell you the truth, I would suggest that it was kind of a racist way of thinking about things. However, it's not quite as abjectly racist as you might imagine. That was a time when nobody really knew where people came from. It was a time when guns, germs, and steel was not on the tip of everybody's tongue. People did not realize that where the agricultural and industrial revolution happened has a lot to do with the way that, education developed, science developed, and those kinds of things. And so people were still pretty prone to thinking that the places that had the biggest buildups of science and academy and all those things that we consider as the pinnacles of human intelligence and whatever it is that we are, there weren't really good explanations for that. And so, in my mind, it was actually sort of natural for people to be looking for, some sort of explanation in places that they perceived as being places where those things were happening. And yeah, you're right. I mean, we know that it's racist now, right? And it was, in a way, racist, but this is the kind of racism that's happening in the lead up and just after World War I, when you could have considered sort of anti-German attitudes as racist. And there were competitions between the French and the Germans and the English for where those human fossils were going to be, right? A lot of people, even at the time, were saying that those Homo erectus fossils from Indonesia were apes, right? Dubois, the guy who found those, went to his grave with most people saying that he was a crack, you know? So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had one thing that's separate. Maybe I'll. Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. Okay. Yeah, maybe I'll get on to this a little more, but I was wondering about the dating of those Java and Asian samples. I presume early on they didn't really have much to go on, and they don't have the volcanic layers that made the stuff, some of the things in Africa, much more usable once they got potassium argon dating going and things like that. But what was known then, and if you're not going to go any further, what is known about the timing on those samples?
Yeah, and that's a really, really good point. Without this understanding of how deep time went, and radiometric dating, volcanic dating, and even radiocarbon dating wasn't until the last half of the 20th century, right? The potassium argon dating is in sort of the mid-1950s, first gets applied in 1960 or something like that to the Olduvai Gorge specimens, and that had a profound effect. And you guys might know that it was at that time that the land mammal stages were also dated. So Pliocene, Pleistocene, those things didn't have any dates on them that were real until the 1950s and 1960s. And that is a really, really big part of this sort of difficulty with understanding how far back these lineages stretched. And once that happens, then people start to develop sort of a gut feeling for how much time it takes for different kinds of evolutionary change to go down. It's really important to stuff like that. From with the benefit of hindsight, a lot of these old ideas just seem stupid, right? But they're not really. They might be biased, and they might be incredibly ethnocentric in the way that we think of those sorts of things now, and they're racist in the way that we think of things now. But I don't know if that's really the right way to characterize what was going on in these people's minds, right? I mean, it was racist, right? But at the same time, they didn't really have the same kind of information that we have now. And, we can really clearly say, and you know what, to tell you the truth, there were a lot of guys, like Els Herdlichka is a very famous guy who was really talking about how all these ideas were kind of racist at that time, back in the 20s. But because he didn't really have evidence behind him, he could just get sort of not listened to. So I'm going to take one more, and then I'm going to keep rolling.
I'm thinking of the National Geographic's Geome project, and I, such as many others, have gone ahead and mapped their genomes. And it seemed like, from what I've studied, I have a much higher concentration of the Neanderthal and the Denisovan that a lot of people have had. And so I'm just curious, if there has been any attempts to take those people that have higher percentages of markers and see how they actually are from a genetic and from a social aspect.
To see if there's any Neanderthal
Studies.
Behaviors that's still lingering?
different than the way people generally act, or in society, or physically, if there are any difference in their behaviors.
I mean, it's really fascinating. As far as I know, it's sort of hard to get funding for those kind of studies, but one that I can point you to, I don't know the authors on it, but I just read about it in the paper like a month ago. Some high altitude adaptations in Tibet are actually introgressions from the Denisovan genome. And I mean, that's fascinating that you would have functional introgression from these archaic genomes. I mean, it has a lot of meaning, and it makes you wonder if some other stuff might actually be functional that got integrated. There's a lot of there's a lot more work to be done before we can really be definitive about like that kind of functional genetic stuff as being relevant to the Neanderthal question or the Denisova question. But people are starting. If you Google like Denisova and Tibet, you'll find the article, or at least the press releases associated with it. The Denisovans, the Papua New Guineans. There's also a little bit of like a... Well, I can't really speak too much of that. All I would say is there's a lot more work to be done. There's places in South America where you pick up some of those Denisovan genes also, and it's not really clear if it's signal or if it's noise, and that's not really my specialty, but I would say that probably over the next 20 years, we're going to be understanding that stuff a lot more. Yeah. So now we'll talk about the actual fossils, huh? Instead of all that key theory. Well, we'll talk about a little bit of theory. So if you look at, and there's going to be a lot of plots like this for the next part of the talk, with Eurasia over here and Africa over here, right? The type specimen for Homo erectus is kind of way out on the suburbs of the overall distribution of humans during that time. And, you know, I say in class that it's kind of an unfortunate place to have found it. If I were to choose the place to find the first Homo erectus fossil, I would have chosen Africa at about 1 million years ago. That would have been a nice, sensible place to name a species. But that's not where it's named. It's named out here, and it's named for fossils that are found on the Indonesian archipelago, the Indonesian set of islands. And, you know, that's sort of a weird place. Anybody know what happens with climate change out there? It turns into an ocean, and then a peninsula, and then a sea, and then a peninsula. And so there's all kinds of different possible sort of weird evolutionary dynamics that could happen out there. And the other thing is that, this is geography, and you'll be able to see it a little bit better on coming slides, but this in the gray area is Eurasia, from Western Eurasia to Eastern Eurasia, and in the white over here is Africa. Well, Homo sapiens is the blue on the top. Happens real recently and really fast, right? And it's only in the last 100,000, or actually like 50,000 years or so, that you really are sure that Homo sapiens has spread across that neck of the woods. Did I knock our thing off center? Okay, I'll leave it. Okay, so keep that in mind as we start talking about the next thing. We've got Africa over here, Eurasia over here, and actually the fossils that we're talking about are sort of few and far between, it turns out. There's not a whole bunch of well-dated fossil specimens, you know, especially when you're talking about complete crania, there's not that many localities, and that's something that's really important to think about when you're thinking about these interpretations, and that's one of the reasons why new discoveries have such an impact, because there's not that much stuff that's known, and so almost any time something new gets found, you have some impact on our understanding of the human evolutionary record. Now, when I introduce Homo erectus, I find it really useful to do this sort of basic time and space breakdown to introduce the fossils. So we've got Africa, Western and Central Eurasia, and Eastern Eurasia. We've got the early Pleistocene, the later early Pleistocene, and the beginning of the middle Pleistocene. And that's kind of how I'm going to break it down. I'm going to be talking about each one of these places, or just showing you skulls from each one of these places so that you can kind of get a sense of what's going on. I'm going to start with stuff that's not Homo erectus because it's actually sort of central to the topic. To tell you the truth, I could talk a whole bunch about this robust Australopithecus versus early Homo split, but Homo habilis is what most people kind of refer to this early genus Homo stuff after the split. And there's an arbitrary line that divides Homo habilis from Homo erectus. It's not like there's a speciation event that would, Ernst Mayr would be happy with. Here's some Homo habilis fossils. These are stuff from Cubiphora. There's a sort of smaller one on top, bigger one on the bottom. These guys have people arguing about whether there's different species, right? People say that the big one is Homo rudolfensis. In fact, that's how it was described by the same guy who makes a big deal out of Homo ergaster, and that the little one is Homo habilis. I don't know. It seems it's kind of a stretch to be thinking that these two kinds of things are coexisting at Cubiphora and they're different species, but different talk. Early African Homo erectus is kind of like an extension of Homo habilis, and there's no real distinction between Homo habilis and Homo erectus in terms of a speciation event. It's something that we see cranial capacities expanding. And one of the things that I will point out is that up until this robust Australopithecus and early genus Homo split, brain size is pretty much like a chimp, right? Some Australopithecus boisei and those guys have, 100 cc's or so more than a chimp, but it's really with the genus Homo that we start to see an exponential rise in cranial capacity. And in many ways, this sort of change in cranial capacity is what a lot of people lock onto when they're thinking about these differences in different groups. I lock onto it a little bit also, although one of the things you have to be careful of is if I was able to get your skulls and pour rice into your skulls and figure out how many cc's each one of you guys had, there'd be quite a bit of variation in the room, right? And it doesn't actually seem like it's all that correlated with intelligence unless there's a pathological smallness of the cranium. There's not really been a whole bunch of difference that people can put their finger on when it comes to looking at different crania of Homo sapiens and establishing any kind of difference in ability based on cranial capacity, except in pathological cases. But a lot of this discussion hinges on cranial capacity. Okay, so in this early Homo erectus group is the type specimen for Homo ergaster, and this is really the only mandible that I'm going to be talking about a whole bunch. To tell you the truth, there's lots of discussion on the teeth, and in many ways the teeth are probably just as good of a thing to look at. But in this sort of overview, it's kind of more fun to look at the skull, so I keep it there. Now, these are the things that are sort of classically put into Homo ergaster, and one of the things that you have to remember is that when these things were talked about in the 80s and 90s, there really wasn't much known in terms of million-year-old Homo erectus from Africa. That age range comes later, right? And so when people were comparing Asian Homo erectus with African Homo erectus, they were really comparing early African Homo erectus with kind of middle-of-the-road Asian Homo erectus. And you do see change in cranial capacity over time. In fact, it's going crazy, right? There's been a lot of new fossils discovered in Eastern Africa that fit into this general range. Some of you might know about the Turkana boy. One of the first pretty complete skeletons is found. Oops, I messed up on a slide there, but 12-year-old kid, about 880 cc's. This is a really great fossil. It's about 1.5 million years old. People traditionally have put this into Homo ergaster. Early Western Eurasian hominids have come to light in the last 20 years or so. Probably some of you guys have heard of the Dmanisi specimens. There's now 5 published crania, a whole bunch of mandibles. There's the new skull that associates with the mandibles, and there's all those guys lined up together. And one of the things that we see with the Dmanisi specimens is that there's quite a bit of variation. This is important because in a lot of places where you don't have multiple individuals coming from the same level, it's really difficult to establish variation. Any modern zoologist who goes out and studies animals will tell you that variation happens, and you know what? We're all animals. Look around. There's plenty of variation in the room. And I guess you would sort of figure that this would happen in prehistoric humans as well, but without all the evidence, it's sort of easier to say that each new morphological discovery is a new species. Finds like this and other ones that I'll talk about in a second really go a long way to help us establish that we should expect quite a bit of variation, actually, and that sort of leads us to not really be as quick to the punch when it comes to naming new species. Early Eastern Eurasian Homo erectus, some of them have been dated to be pretty early indeed. Really well-dated stuff starts at about 1.5 million years in the Sangaron Dome and continues through about 1 million years. So it looks like when hominids expand into the old world, they kind of spread all across the tropical part of Eurasia, making it all the way across sort of southern central Eurasia into Indonesia. And the area in white is a big peninsula, so it's not hard to imagine. You don't have to hypothesize Homo erectus boats in order for them to get to Java, right? So we've got lots of fossils from there. Classic Homo erectus from Africa really wasn't discovered until recently. Now, this fossil, OH9, was actually discovered a long time ago. People knew about this in the 70s when they were talking about when they were beginning to talk about differences between African and Eurasian Homo erectus, but there was a lot of controversy about it. Some people wanted to include it in Homo erectus, some people put it in Homo ergaster. One of the big problems, though, was that it was hard to date, and to tell you the truth, this fossil was not found in situ, and so that's part of the reason why people had always felt comfortable with leaving it out of the discussion. Here's the one I found. It's only one fossil, but it's sort of important. We got a really good date on this one, and it looks like Homo erectus from Eurasia, right? And If you guys win the book, you'll be able to see what I say about that. There's other fossils from the Horn of Africa that are also really similar, also about 1 million years old, and also very Homo erectus-like. If we go to Western Eurasia, it turns out that in Europe and sort of west of the Urals, you don't have a whole bunch of different specimens that we can really attribute to Homo erectus. We know that there were hominids there because there's archaeology there. However, there's not a lot of great material. There's a relatively good new specimen from Turkey, Kokobash. I spelled it in the sort of anglicized version. It should be spelled with an S with what do you call that thing on the bottom of it? Anyway, Kokobash is how you say it, so we'll leave it like that. Atapuerca grandolina also has some pretty early fossils. It's a gill and a mandible. They've named it a new species. I put it in quotes because I'm not really comfortable with using that as a new species. I'm not sure that it's not Homo erectus, right? Let's go to the Eastern Eurasian clastic site. So around 1 million years, there's plenty of Homo erectus from this area. Some relatively recent stuff to be found, Ganwangling, Lanqian in China. Trinil was the first one discovered. It fits into the sort of classic Homo erectus. I mean, what else could be classic Homo erectus? But it's about 1 million years old from Indonesia. Sangaron, we already talked about a little bit. There's more specimens from Sangaron that have shown up, and actually people have discussed about variation in this as well, and you do see variation, although without the faces, it's not quite as striking of a contrast as you see with the Dmanisi specimens. Now, something that's really interesting about the eastern part of Eurasia is that we see classic Homo erectus persisting much more recently. It persists up through time longer than it does in Africa. We see advanced forms and advanced technologies in Africa before we see them in the eastern part of Eurasia. Chokutien is a great example, although there are some recent dates that suggest that it's about 700,000 years old. A lot of people still think it's closer to 500,000, but it's later. And if you look at some other specimens, Yongchan, Hoshan, these are relatively late, at least in terms of the dating that's available, and they are classic Homo erectus, right? And Gandong and Sangaron, these ones might possibly be a little bit younger, and actually you start to see larger cranial capacities in these, but they're still classic Homo erectus in their shape. Now, I'm going to avoid giving species names for this. There are species names that are available for post-Homo fossils, or post erectus fossils in Africa. Homo rhodesiensis, Homo heidelbergensis, or some of the names that get kicked around. I'm specifically avoiding those right now because I know that a lot of people are talking about them and making a big deal out of the speciose nature of that kind of part of the fossil record. But to me, it doesn't really look like that. We'll leave it as post-erectus Homo. And one of the things that you see in Africa when you get into around 500,000 years ago is cranial capacities that are within the range of modern Homo sapiens, right? They sort of transition into that. Now, like I said, you probably got 400 cc's of variation represented in just this auditorium, right? But so we can't really make a big deal out of the differences, but these are higher cranial capacities on average than what you're seeing in the eastern part of Eurasia at the same time. In Dutu in Tanzania, this one has slightly smaller. This one's not well dated, it's a surface find, but these are these sort of things that people put a question mark by. Do we call this Homo erectus or what? And they have kind of higher cranial capacities, and as we'll see in a second, they're also associated with new technologies. Western Eurasian post-erectus, there's Soprano, which actually looks a lot like Homo erectus. It makes you wonder what's going on there. To tell you the truth, it makes me wonder about the dating of this site more than anything. This was found in a road cut, but a lot of you might have heard of the Cima de los Huesos specimens, and there's now 17 crania from the Cima de los Huesos. It's a really, really rich site, and these guys are starting to show a few Neanderthal characteristics. 1125 to 1400, they have enough that we can actually sort of look at a distribution, and the high end of that certainly overlaps with a modern human distribution. But if you were to do your best to make a Gaussian curve out of these guys, what you'd find is that it was outside of the range of modern humans. There's a lot of Neanderthal features in the Cima de los Huesos specimens, and I would say that there's close to a consensus that these are Neanderthal ancestors, right? It stands to reason. Eastern Eurasian post-erectus Homo, when we start to get into the sort of really later times, and we're not talking about stuff that's all that old at all, only about 180,000 years old, we still see things that are really Homo erectus-like, right? And that's fascinating. It's interesting. Now, a lot of this stuff does not have great dates, right? And so I have to throw that out there, that these are not things that are perfectly well dated. But when you do look at these things that are 100 and 200,000 years old, you don't see Neanderthals. You don't see anatomically modern humans. These look like sort of Homo erectus things that are on the fringe of whatever it is that's going on in especially Africa, but also sort of drifting into Central Eurasia a little bit. So let's recap that really fast, and then we'll get into the archaeology so that you can see what these guys are doing. Okay, so Africa at about 1.7 million years old really doesn't look all that different from what you've got in the southern part of Eurasia at 1.7. About 800 cc's, 900 cc cranial capacity, and they don't look all that different. In fact, a lot of people have made comparisons between the Dmanisi specimens, and this is the Turkana that you see there, a specimen that we talked about, the one that had the skeleton from about 1.5 million years ago. At about 1 million years, cranial capacities have expanded, but you still don't really see any major striking differences between Africa and Eurasia, right? Yeah, cranial capacity is evolving, I guess. That's a good way to think about it. But at 1 million years, it's still really hard to make a distinction between Africa and Eurasia. When you get to about 500,000 years, though, you start to see some differences between Africa and Eurasia. You start to see more advanced forms in Africa. And one of the things that I will also point out is that you're starting to see, actually, to tell you the truth, in Africa, there's always been, throughout the Acheulean, more advanced technology than what you see in the eastern part of Eurasia and actually the western part for most of the time as well. So how do I define Homo erectus? Well, that's kind of how I define Homo erectus. It's hard for me to know exactly what to do with some of those really, really late Eurasian ones. The stuff that's at about 1 million years for me in Africa and Eurasia is both Homo erectus. I know that Dmanisi and things like the Turkana boy and some of those other Cubiforus specimens have smaller cranial capacities than what you see a little bit later in Africa and a little bit later in Eurasia, but I'm not comfortable with drawing a line here and saying that this is a different species than that. That's why I don't ascribe to the Homo ergaster concept. So that's how I define Homo erectus, right? So let's get to the technology. Now I can pass around a couple of different specimens. One plaster cast that feels a lot like a real tool. This is a cast of an Oldowan tool from Olduvai, and this is hard to know exactly what they used it for, but probably for butchering meat. You find a bunch of cut marks at the same time that these things come into the world. And this is a really late Acheulean stone tool. And a lot of you guys have probably heard the terms Oldowan and Acheulean. It gets confusing when you're starting to look at some of the earliest Acheulean, though. And to tell you the truth, it's almost best to kind of think about it as Acheulean versus non-Acheulean. The Acheulean is mostly defined by symmetry, right? When you start to see like symmetry in the tools, a lot of people will call that Acheulean. And as I'll argue in a second, or just sort of point out in a second, it's not as simple as finding one tool, because at a lot of these sites, you find thousands of stone tools. And even when you're just sort of trying to make really crude choppers and bifacially flaking them on both sides, some of them are going to look more Acheulean than others, just accidentally, you know. Some will look more symmetrical than others. When you look at the Acheulean, there's absolutely a difference between the early part of the Acheulean and the later part of the Acheulean. The symmetrical one that's getting passed around right now, that's a good example of late Acheulean. That one is made by a friend of mine. It's based on the same material that you find around Saint Achule, so that's about as Acheulean as it gets, right? You'll see that it actually looks really similar to this specimen that was nicely allowed for me to use by Pete Brostrom. You can see the distinction there. I'm going to show you some more early Acheulean tools, but first let's think about what these things are being used for. It's hard to know, right? I mean, how do you really know? You find cut marks on bones, you know they're using the stone tools to butcher bones, but why the hand axe? Why these large cutting tools? Well, it actually is not that hard to speculate if you've ever tried to butcher an animal with flakes versus large cutting tools. Jackson right now has a sore hand, It's so much easier when you're using the whole hand axe. It actually works really, really well to butcher an animal when you've got that big stone tool. It's easier to cut through. Your hand doesn't get as tired. Your hand doesn't cramp up. So, that's not exactly a time machine going back and seeing what Homo erectus was doing, but, I can see why you would use a hand axe rather than a flake just from doing that. Were these guys right or left-handed? Well, there have been studies that have looked into that you can observe that when you hold the tool in one hand and use a different hand for the hammer, predominantly right-handed people are going to hold the core in their left hand and whack the little flakes off with their right hand, and they actually show up as different, right? And so some people have looked at flake distributions and suggested that there's handedness, like right-handedness gets started sometime during this early stone tool use. There has been a lot of criticism, and the criticism comes from observing other stone tool manufacturers and saying, some right-handers make a much higher proportion of the right-handed flakes than others. In fact, some right-handed people end up putting the core in their right hand and using the left hand as the hammer. So it's not totally cut and dry. There's a little bit of evidence. To tell you the truth, it's one of those things where I'm not so sure the test is what leads me to think that handedness might have been being started at that time. It makes sense, right? There's a lot of meat eating going on, right? One of the things that you start to see a lot at these Homo erectus or contemporaneous sites is lots of cut marks on bones. They were using the stone tools to butcher meat, and that's not all that controversial. It's pretty well established. There are some places where Homo erectus is quarrying material, where they are using like big hammers to knock pieces off of good raw material. Generally speaking, in fact, there's not really a whole bunch of great studies, but where it has been studied, it doesn't look like Homo erectus is moving very far away from the places where it's acquiring the raw materials. There's no good evidence that they're going farther than 5 kilometers or so. And when you get into later times, Middle Stone Age and Late Stone Age, you see scores and scores of kilometers distance that's covered from the place of the raw materials source to the place where the stone tool production and use is happening. And once you get into Homo sapiens, long distance trade is going hundreds of kilometers. There's lots of different ways they acquire these flakes. Some are river cobbles, some are taking big cobbles and knocking flakes off and then using that as a blank to make the Acheulean hand axe. So let's look a little bit over time at what these things look like. If you look at 1.7 million years, like if you look at the Dmanisi stuff, I'll show you some of the Dmanisi tools. They don't have that Acheulean sort of symmetrical characteristic shape. But at about 1.7 is when you start to see this shape start to happen in Africa, right? Are those Acheulean or not? I guess that's sort of a question, but most people see that things are starting. There's what things look like at Dmanisi. There's what they look like at the really early layers in Conso. I'll go back there for a second. There's not a lot of symmetry represented in that Dmanisi sample, right? There's not a lot of symmetry. At Conso, you have a nice sort of sequence over time, going from about 1.7 to about 1.2 or 1.3 million years. And you can actually see these changes going along. And by the time that you get to 1.2 million years, that actually, most people would recognize that as Acheulean. And one of the things that's important is that there's a high percentage of these large tools that has that symmetrical shape, right? They were still using what's called a hard hammer technique, which means that they're using one rock to knock flakes off of another rock. Later in the Acheulean, they start to use soft hammers, like bits of antler and things like that. But early on, it's all hard hammers. Now, at about 1 million years, there's really good Acheulean in Africa. And outside of Africa, you have a lot of people arguing about whether there's Acheulean or not. You can find Acheulean-looking tools, but it's just not like you have this really easy-to-argue broad distribution of Acheulean tools. You find stuff like that at the Daka member in Ethiopia. This is from a site called Ubudaya. I have another slide that shows that. But people point at these tools and say, those really do look Acheulean, but other people argue back and say, well, how many tools did you find at Ubudaya to pick out these 3 that look Acheulean? In the Daka member, they look really, really good, right? Almost all the big cutting tools that you find are these sort of symmetrical shape. And sure, there's small flakes and things like that, but at a place like Orogasili, I put the hammer in there so that you can see the size, right? That's how big a hammer is. That's how big those tools are. These are Acheulean. These are just classic. Well, nope, that one is that one's modern, but everybody knows what a hammer looks like. This is a regular-sized hammer, not one of those little tiny ones for scale. And I've got a nice hammer in with a lot of the other ones too, just so you can see what they look like. To sort of point out what is going on in Africa and how it's different from what you see in Eurasia at about 1 million years. At a site called Orogasili, there are lots of stone tools on the surface. And when you compare the different shapes of stone tools, you find that these nice, symmetrical Acheulean tools are by far the highest proportion of the large tools that are on the surface. And that's really different than some of the other places in Eurasia where you don't really see the same distribution. You might find one or two things that'll fit into that Acheulean bin, but it's not the same as what you see at a place like Orogasili. Grandolina at Atapuerca is about 1 million years old. This has been argued to be kind of a piece of Acheulean, and it kind of does look Acheulean, right? But you just don't have the same kind of distribution that you do at a place like Orogasili. Another popular site that's pointed to as being a good example of potentially Acheulean, I don't know if I should attempt that, Adarampakam in India. There's thousands of these sort of halfway Acheulean looking things, and the best of them really do look Acheulean. The worst of them do not look so Acheulean, and they have a different distribution than what you find at a place like Orogasili. Here's Ubadiah in Israel with some of the best ones. I work with archaeologists that swear hands down that this stuff is Acheulean. It depends on how you define it. If you define it typologically by saying, look, this one is symmetrical and you can see that it's bifacially flaked on both sides, well, okay. If you define it based on the percentages of tools that end up being like this, it's a little bit different. So I call it almost Acheulean. Now, when you get to 500,000 or so, you get stuff that's really definitely good Acheulean, soft hammer flaking and stuff like that when you're looking in Africa, and eventually that drifts into Europe and Western Asia as well. You still have Eastern Eurasia without this really characteristic Acheulean. There's a lot of discussion about it, but let's see. This is what you find in Ethiopia and Africa at about that time, in France at about that time. The thing that's getting passed around right now is an example of the kind of hand axe that you find in France at about 400,000 years old. Cima de los Huesos has one hand axe that's come out, but it's a nice, refined, advanced hand axe that has a soft hammer percussion that's, it's a good hand axe. When you get into Eastern Eurasia, it's sort of better than that stuff at 1 million years ago, but we still don't have this really classic distribution of the Acheulean where most of the large cutting tools that you're finding are symmetrical and are hand axes. There's a lot of arguments as to why this might have been the case. Certainly the hominids sort of look like they'd be advanced enough to have Acheulean tools. It might be that there's lower population densities. There's discussions about, cultural transmission being different in Africa because of higher population densities. There's also discussions about things like, well, maybe the availability of things like bamboo made Acheulean hand axes not be so indispensable as they were in places like Africa. A lot of people have discussed fire and Homo erectus, and there's a lot of, it's actually hard to detect human-induced fire in the archaeological record. If you find charcoal in a horizon, you can't necessarily be sure that that's from a human-made fire, right? You need better evidence than that. And so a lot of the really early discoveries of charcoal that some people claim is fire, other people say it might be naturally occurring. The first place where you get something of a consensus about whether there's fire or not is at a place called Gesher Benet Yaakov in Israel. And it's not as good as what you find with Neanderthals and some of the later stuff where you find a ring of rocks and then there's a burned inside of the rocks. And then if you look at the bones, there's bones that have stuff where the muscles were that's not burned, where the muscles were not, it's burned. That's a fire. That's something that's really, really easily distinguished. At this site, it's not quite that good, but you do find certain hominid activity. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of Acheulean stone tools from this locality. You also have places where humans were definitely acting because they have debitage. You can refrit the flakes onto some of these tools so you know that they're there and producing them. And then you have charcoal in localized areas that occurs with burned edible plants, right? So it's not exactly like finding a fire pit, but a lot of people think that that's not such bad evidence that they were actually using fire in that area. And so I'd say about 700,000 years is when you have the earliest, best examples of fire use. Okay, so let's look at this stuff over time. We're almost there. To recap, at 1.7 million years, you've got these kind of early Homo erectus looking things, and in Africa, you've got stuff that's getting close to being Acheulean. Outside of Africa, there's no Acheulean. There's really simple stone tools, and they're really broadly distributed. At 1 million years, you've got great Acheulean in Africa, arguable Acheulean outside of Africa. At 500,000 years or so ago, you have advanced Acheulean in Africa, and then pretty quickly after that into Western Eurasia, and stuff that's, again, arguably Acheulean, although it's a little bit different than that earlier things. It's not quite the same kind of Acheulean industry that you have. If you want to look at some of this stuff plotted out over time, there's a website that I made that puts together about 2,000 different localities and the kind of archaeology that they have, called stonesbones.org/Taudevel. This is a logarithmic scale. The yellow is Acheulean, the red is Oldowan, and the blue is Middle Stone Age. And you can kind of see this pattern. But the other thing that's apparent on this is how sort of sloppy the pattern is too, right? There's a lot of overlap between these sites where you've got Acheulean and Oldowan. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to put this slide in here is to show you that that kind of really objective, cut and dry explanation that I gave isn't quite so objective and cut and dry when you actually look at the data. Yes, there is that pattern that, there's a couple 100,000 years earlier Acheulean that you find in Africa than outside of Africa, but, and some of these dots are actually the arguable Acheulean places too. But you do certainly see that there is a patterning of things happening first in Africa and then extending outside of Africa. And whether that has to do with population densities or actual population movements or things like that, nobody really knows at this point. Okay, so here's a picture of Homo erectus. You know what? This is actually an accurate representation because there's lots of nice squatting facets on Homo erectus femurs. You can tell that they were squatting down a lot. So there's more than just the stone tools that they're using and the hard hammer technique that they're using. And actually, that's a picture from just right outside the Daka member with the same, actually, that's a modified mammal to go along with a million-year-old mammal that did actually exist there. So that's probably about as good of a picture as it gets of Homo erectus. Now, what happens to Homo erectus? Where does it go? The things that come next are really interesting. They happen in Africa, right? About 500,000 years ago, you start to pick up evidence for ochre. A little bit after that, evidence for hafting and projectiles. Regular fire use starts to be something that's more common. Although, actually, as you might expect, you see evidence for more fire occurring outside of Africa at about the same time, right? It's probably colder. And you also see a new type of flaking technology that starts to happen about 400,000 or 300,000 years ago called la Valois, or prepared core technology. And that is something that results from people actually not just having a preconceived shape in their mind, but actually preparing a core to remove the final flake that's going to be in the shape that they want. You start to see that kind of thing happening a little bit around 400 or 500,000 years, and then by about 300,000 years in Africa, it's really being utilized. And then at about 200,000 years, you start to see that stuff outside of Africa. Whew. Okay, so what do we think of Homo erectus these days? Well, I hate to see this line through Homo erectus. I don't really think of it as being unilineal anymore, but I do think that Homo erectus is our ancestor, and I do think that without all the discussion about whether or not there's little isolated cul-de-sacs of different lineages, which quite probably there were, right? It's just that it's just as much of a stretch to say that there's a bunch of bushies to there being one single lineage. I mean, both of those are probably, you might be able to say that there were dead ends, right? But you can't draw the topography of those any better than you can draw the topography of a single line. Now, I would not draw a line between these things, but I would say that Homo erectus is your ancestor, and I would say that when I think about the human evolutionary record, that without like even discussing whether or not there's a bunch of like a bush-like phylogeny or a single line, I think about these groups evolving and I contemplate the complicated nature of population structure at the same time. I don't have a problem with putting those two things together. So honestly, I think that Homo erectus still is your daddy. I think that he still is like a good thing to think about when you're thinking about your ancestors about 1 million or 1.5 million years ago. We have a lot more information about what happens after that, but Homo erectus is still a good ancestor. And so with that, thank you very much. And something's going to happen if I get it correctly here. I brought a book that I'm going to give away. Do I have my phone in my pocket? I do have my phone in my pocket. Sure. Whoever calls that phone number first gets the book. Sure. Okay. Thank you. There's only one phone number there. Whoever calls me first, I was going to get some raffle tickets, but this one will work. It's my Google phone number, so I can turn it on and off at will, and I can see who's calling and not take the number. This is the one that I have at the university, so it's not really my direct line into the house. Oh, there we go. Here we go. Hello? Hello? All right. We have a winner. Oh no, it's you, right? Yeah. Okay. I know. No, I heard you on the phone, so I know it's you. So I'll give you the book and I'll sign it to you in a second. Are there any questions before?
Any more questions? Oops, sorry. Oops. So about 1 million years ago, they were improving their tools to the point in Africa you would say they were more sophisticated than outside of Africa. But we depict them as hairy. Really close. We depict them as being hairy.
Yeah, all the hair is purely conjectural. Nobody knows how hairy our ancestors were because it doesn't preserve, right? No, you don't know, and it's really interesting. I guess a traditional way to do it is to think that Australopithecus is hairy and that something about the genus Homo made us lose our hair. It seems pretty arbitrary to me. I'm not even going to cite the studies. There's been some sort of weird ways to look at that, but to tell you the truth, we just don't know. The skin doesn't preserve, the hair doesn't preserve, so any of those kinds of reconstructions are going to be based on conjecture. Yeah.
So do you have any ideas about the difference between Homo neanderthal and Homo denisovan?
Like the difference between Denisovans and Neanderthals? Well, one of the things that I can tell you, although I think that there's a lot of work to be done to understand what a derived character is in terms of genetics. They recently did mitochondrial DNA on the Semidales hueso specimens, which are morphologically pre-Neanderthal, and those guys are really similar to the Denisovans in their genetics. And so I guess that there might be some reason to think, if you're willing to make, and it's a big leap. I mean, it's one mitochondrial sequence from the Semidales hueso specimens that's kind of similar to the sequence from the Denisovans. However, they might be kind of ancestral, I guess. I guess that's a good way to put it. Again, the jury's not in on that, and that's not my specialty. That's not what I'm really versed in. Yeah.
Regarding the assessment of fire about 700,000 years ago, what year did we initially make that conclusion with confidence?
The Gesher-Bennett-Yakov stuff is less than 20 years old, and I'm not sure exactly when that is. There's other sites like Wonderwork that have charcoal that's about 1 million years old, but that's controversial because it's not really associated with the same degree of human industry and human activity. There's places like Chesawanja that are even older than that have been suggested that they could easily be lightning strikes. There's also the Chokutien fire stuff that's only 500 to 700,000 that most people write off as just naturally occurring charcoal. So that really early fire question is really tough, and Gesher Bennett Yaakov is just sort of the earliest best one, and it's the first one where you see people feeling some kind of confidence, and I would say that it's all about the fact that there's such a high level of hominid activity in that area. There's clear evidence that hominids are not just passing through, that they're actually staying there and making stone tools, and that those fire concentrations are localized, and there's potentially edible plant material that appears burned in those concentrations. But like I said, that's really different from finding a ring of stones that's burned on the inside that has charcoal on the inside of that ring of stones, and you find that stuff with Neanderthals, right? So, yeah.
My question's about a physical characteristic too, namely the brow ridges. I couldn't help but notice how tremendously robust the brow ridges are on many of these skulls, and I know the reasoning behind reduction in jaw size and the discussion about cranial ridges, but why do you think the brow ridges became reduced as people became more modern?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of different ways that you might answer that question. I'll say one thing that's sort of conjectural to sort of throw something out there that's kind of untestable. This guy named Russ Shahan, in a popular book, suggested that the kind of really thick skulls that you see in Homo erectus, that you don't really see in stuff before that, and you don't really see in modern humans, relates to the fact that they might have been bashing each other over the head with these rocks, right? So cranial thickness might have something to do with that. Now, when you're looking at brow ridges, what you have with brow ridges is something that is associated with that overall cranial robusticity. And when you move into modern humans, what's happening is an expansion of the frontal. So if my frontal is not there, then I've got brow ridges, right? They might not be as robust as the kind of brow ridges that you see in these really thick skulled things, but without that expanded frontal, you'd see my brow ridges, right? And so part of what we see as brow ridges is actually related to the expansion of the neural cavity. It's related to the expansion of the frontal part of the brain. Overall robusticity, it's untestable, it's speculative, it's conjectural. It seems reasonable to think, though, that they got helmet heads, right? I don't know, maybe, but you can't test that. That's just sort of nothing. To tell you the truth, there's increased robusticity in a lot of non-industrial, non-agricultural revolution human populations as well, and it's hard to know what the functional reason for that, or if there's even a functional reason to be found. Yeah, I heard that one too. Yeah, so we should be measuring our crania to see whether or not we're going to be criminals or not. I don't know. I think that we tried that in the 1800s. Didn't work. Yeah.
Two questions. Is there an approximate extinction date for Homo erectus? And two, any relationship in your idea between erectus and floresiensis?
Okay. Well, as far as an extinction date, in Africa there wasn't one. In Africa, Homo erectus, right? So there's not an extinction date in Africa. If you're looking at the eastern part of Eurasia, it's sort of difficult to tell, because when you're looking at that stuff that's after 500,000 years or so, there's higher cranial capacities. It just doesn't look like a Neanderthal. It doesn't look like the kind of pre-sapien stuff that you've got going in Africa. It doesn't look like, how do you explain that? Do you explain it as there being some sort of in situ evolution in Eastern Eurasia, or is there gene flow from these things that are happening in the sort of more the center of human evolution, which would be sub-Saharan Africa? I don't know, but you do see that those populations go away as modern Homo sapiens spreads in and takes over from those places. As far as the extinction of Homo erectus in the western part of Eurasia, the problem is that we don't have a really good fossil record of classic Homo erectus in the western part of Eurasia to say that it ever went away. It looks like they're kind of, you find the record's not really good enough to be definitive about this, but you find them more in sort of subtropical areas, right? That might be one of the good explanations for why they're not occurring in a big concentration in the western part of Eurasia. I'm speculating, but in Africa there was no extinction, and that's one of the big points that I like to make. Homo erectus is your ancestor, right?
So 2 questions. One is just to what extent is the cranial capacity calibrated with regard to the overall body size? I mean, how often are these skulls found next to other fossils that would let us know how big the overall individual was? And then the second question is, that just at the most rough level, how many total Homo erectus skulls have we found? Tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands?
Sure. Okay, so I'll answer the last question first because it's sort of easier. Probably 40. That's probably the number of Homo erectus skulls that exist out there. It's not a statistically large sample, right? You're not talking about stuff where you can really answer a lot of these questions. As for postcranial size versus cranial size, again, we don't have a lot of good evidence for that. There's very few places where you actually have skeletons and like individuals associated. Fortunately, at about the same sort of time that Turkana boy, which is a cranial capacity of about 800 cc's and probably about 5.5 feet tall, is at about the same cranial capacity as the Dmanisi specimens, which are significantly shorter. So it does look like there's some sort of environmental, non-necessarily cranial capacity related thing, but the sample size is too small to be definitive on that. Certainly when you get later into Neanderthals, you have much bigger cranial capacities and in a lot of cases pretty small statures. And don't forget that we're all corn and beef fed individuals and that we're much taller than our ragamuffin industrial revolution ancestors, right? Even 100 or 150 years ago, people that didn't have the same kind of nutrition that we have are significantly shorter, right? So there's a lot of ecomorphology, I guess is a good term for it, that's associated with that as well.
Okay. Hello? Yeah. Oh, okay. So, I wonder, what do you make of the time range for the Flores Island samples, and if those really go back to 95,000 years, is there another candidate other than being descendants of residual East Asian Homo erectus for the ancestry of that population?
Well, I guess that my answer is of course going to be my opinion, right? Because there's a lot of different opinions that exist out there, and there have been anything from the recent discussion of Flores being potentially a Down syndrome individual to a microcephalic. We don't have any evidence of Australopithecus in Eurasia, so some of those ideas I don't think are based on actually having any evidence. What people say is, these things have 350 cc's of cranial capacity. Why would these things not be an Australopithecus? After all, Australopithecus is something that has, 4 or 375 cc's cranial capacity in some cases. However, you don't see any hominids outside of Africa till 1.8, and I'm willing to go to 2 million or something like that just because you're probably not going to find the very first one. But there's no evidence of pre-genus Homo outside of Africa. Now, when did they make it across into Flores Island? As you know, there's a little bit of deep water that separates it from what's called the Sunda Shelf, the peninsula that occurs during ice ages. How many of those ice ages happened in 2 million years? We're talking about scores, right? It's not just like 1, it's not 2, it's not 5, it's not even 10. It's a whole bunch of different ice ages that would have turned that archipelago into a big peninsula. Now, which one of those was responsible for the colonization of Flores Island? I don't know. Am I comfortable with there being some Homo erectus-like thing that was one of them? Kind of, yeah. I mean, that's what you find in Java up until relatively recently. You don't really see you don't see anything like Neanderthals or modern humans there until modern humans make it there. So these things that are maybe 200 or 300,000 years old at places like in Gandong do have cranial capacities that are bigger than your average Homo erectus, but plenty of people have argued that that's just the same kind of in situ evolution towards higher cranial capacities that you see all over the place. So if you were to ask me to speculate, and that's all that it would be, I don't have any problem with Flores being the insular, dwarfed descendant of a Homo erectus ancestor. It just doesn't bother me at all, but that's the best I can do.
No one really knows why gravity exists. Naming something doesn't mean that we get it. So I'll live each day